okay, this would be a potentially lengthy lecture ed puzzle type thing that will fill in a lot of informational gaps about the Cold War that we won't get a chance to talk about so much in class. And it's just as easy for you to do this on your own time as it is to have you sit in class and listen. So we're going to do it this way. So we're going to talk about the origin of the Cold War. We're going to take you all the way through to about Vietnam, and then we'll stop for this ed puzzle, and then we'll move on to other things later. So a couple things just to keep in mind. The Cold War maybe got set up at the Yalta Conference in 1945, and that is when the Americans, President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin of the USSR all agreed to split up Europe basically into an Eastern Europe, which would be influenced by the Soviet Union, and Western Europe, which would be USA and UK. And it basically meant that, like, for example, Poland would become a communist country. And they promised elections for all European countries, although that didn't happen. But the point is that even as World War II was ending, there was the winning side was already looking towards what was going to come after World War II. And at the Yalta Conference, it basically was set that it was going to be divided between East and West, East being controlled by Russia, more or less, and then the West being under the influence of the United States. So we talked about the Truman Doctrine last time, and the Truman Doctrine really set out what would become America's foreign policy, which is, okay, we've given the Soviet Union Eastern Europe, but we're not going to let them go any further. We're going to contain them. And that word containment is going to come up again, and it's going to be a critical word for writing your essay. So the idea is we want to contain the spread of communism, and Greece and Turkey were under threat from the communists. So as you remember from a class, Truman basically helped to help the Greeks to not become communist, and also said we will help anyone who's struggling against communism. And so we gave a lot of money to Greece and to Turkey to help them stay in our camp, which is what ultimately happened. Okay, so that's the Truman Doctrine. Sort of following from that was the Marshall Plan, which was named after George C. Marshall, who was Secretary of State and also was the head of all the American armies during World War II. His plan was to send massive amounts of money into Western Europe to help them, because this is a lot of what Western Europe looked like. I mean, it was all rubble after World War II. And the idea was if we help them to build up and to get back up on their feet, they will be friendly to us, and they will not want to become communists. They'll want to be in line with us. We sort of buttered their bread, and we made friends. We helped them build up. They will remain on our side. Okay, so that was the Marshall Plan, also meant to contain communism. And so that led to the division of Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So the green countries here are the NATO countries, and this sort of, I don't know what this is, the sort of pinkish reddish thingy. Those are the Warsaw Pact countries. And these countries joined up with the Soviet Union. They didn't really have much choice. The Russians had their armies in there and said, okay, you're with us now. And we set up NATO, which was an alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And we basically said, okay, all of you guys who are in green here, you're with us, and we will all help you. So if the Russians decide to attack Norway, we'll all get involved and attack the Soviet Union in return. And it was similar to that if we decided to invade Czechoslovakia, all the Warsaw Pact countries would join up. So this is the division of Europe between East and West. And notice how Germany was broken up into two countries after the end of World War II, into East Germany and West Germany. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But it gets to what the basic strategy of the United States was during that time, which is called containment. And that's a key word that you're going to have to know. The idea was that the United States should stop the spread of communism. And we have a few methods of doing that. One is by economic help, like the Marshall Plan, giving money to people to fight communism. Military help, selling them guns if they're fighting communist guerrillas or something. and then using our CIA for shenanigans, which we'll talk about when it comes to some other countries. Okay. But in any case, we are going to make it so that communism just stays in these countries and doesn't spread out. The unshaded countries were neutral. Yugoslavia was communist, but it was not aligned with the Soviet Union. So there's that. Okay. So our thing is called containment, and that was the plan. We're going to stop Russia from expanding their influence. Okay. And this kind of leads to a problem. It's a bit higher level, and take it for what it is. But the question is, what are we trying to contain exactly? Are we trying to contain communism, or are we trying to contain essentially Russia? Is our problem that Russia is too powerful, or is our problem that we don't like communism and we don't want it to spread? There's been, and during that time, there was various debates over, are all communists basically friends with Russia, or can some communists be not friends with Russia? This was a thing that was talked about at the time and still is today in some level. But basically, our policy turned out to be to stop the spread of communism just in general, on the theory that communism spreading was first just bad because communism is bad, and then secondly because it would, of course, give the Russians more power in the world. And so containment, please remember that word. What's that word? Containment. All right. So that's containment. Our overall goal for the United States after World War II was to create this global order. We would use the United Nations, and we would want to create a world where everyone has basically a market capitalist economy with democratic elections where, different parties win different elections, different times. That's what we wanted to see in the world, where we could resolve problems in the United Nations, and that all countries would move towards some sort of market capitalism and democratic elections. The Soviet goals were a little bit different. One is they just wanted to make sure, because, the Soviet Union, Russia has been invaded a few times, and they don't like that. And what they wanted to do was create a buffer zone. And they wanted to make sure that if Russia ever went to war with us, that we couldn't go directly into Russia, that we'd have to go through all these guys. And so that's why these countries, and I should have mentioned this earlier, are called satellite countries. They're different countries, but they're not really independent. They think, they can't really do things if Russia says no. They have to kind of follow Russia's lead. That's what a satellite country is. It's like your own country, but you revolve around some other country. And similarly, these countries, even though we maybe don't like to say this term, but a lot of these countries, at least in the early days of the Cold War, were satellites of the United States. They couldn't really get too far from what we wanted them to do. Otherwise, we'd get our CIA in there and start doing some shenanigans. So we both the United States and the Soviet Union had their satellite countries. And so that was that was how it worked out. So they wanted to make sure, the Russians wanted to make sure that there was a big buffer zone between them and everyone else. And of course, the Russians did have an interest in spreading communism. They supported communist movements in China, in Korea, to Vietnam, to a bit of a lesser extent, Cuba. They wanted communism to spread because they thought that, if the country's communist, they're going to be friendlier to the Soviets than to the Americans. So they had different goals. Now, the other thing you'll notice, too, is that the United States now is globalist. Okay. We talked about the United States kind of flipping back and forth beforehand between globalism and isolationism. Since World War II, down to this day, the United States has been a globalist country. It has been, you might say, the globalist country. Because as a superpower, one of two superpowers, and then now like the only superpower, we are a globalist country now, and we have been since World War II. Okay. So it's worth talking about Berlin a little bit. It was a major flashpoint in the Cold War. It's the capital of Germany, right? And it was divided in half. So as you can see from this map, Germany is divided in half. So you got West Germany, East Germany. The city of Berlin is in here somewhere. It's inside of East Germany. But the deal at the end of World War II was that the Allies would split Germany in two, basically. and they would split Berlin also. Uh, so uh, so Berlin became like the center of the Cold War in many ways, and in different times, very intense center of the Cold War. Um, and one thing that was happening was that capitalism was bringing more wealth to West Berlin than communism was bringing to East Berlin, and this was becoming a problem for the Soviets because basically you had this little enclave of capitalism inside the communist world, and it was making the communist world look bad. So Stalin wanted to get all of Berlin on his side and kick us out. So the first thing he did was this thing that led to the Berlin airlift. And in the Berlin airlift, I keep moving back to the map, but I'm a map guy. So basically, we would run trucks and supplies on the highways through communist territory into West Berlin. And he basically closed the highways and the railways and so on. So Berlin was going to starve to death, basically. But what Truman did was say, nope, you're not going to let Berlin starve to death. We're going to fly all the food they need. We're going to fly it in by plane. And that was the Berlin airlift. And that was really the Berlin airlift. All that was really the beginning of where there was still some hope in the early days after World War II that somehow we can get along with the Russians and the communists. Maybe there's just some way we can work a deal out. By the time the Berlin airlift comes around, when Stalin says, no, I'm just going to starve everyone in West Berlin until you leave, that's when we knew we had an enemy for sure. There was no question about it at that point. So the Berlin airlift in some ways is the beginning of the Cold War. You could say that's the beginning of the Cold War. There was another problem in Berlin, in the city of Berlin. Again, the West has more money than the East, capitalism versus communism. So a lot of people in the East were just, driving across town and moving into the West, right? Why not? Because you can move kind of, not totally freely, but if you lived in East Berlin, you could work in West Berlin. You'd have to have a pass, but as long as you had your papers, you can go through. And the Russians said, no, we're not doing that anymore. You cannot travel between East and West Berlin. So they built the Berlin Wall. And this is a picture of the beginning of that building. And so basically it meant you can't really go through in and out. You have to have real super special permission. But you couldn't live in East Berlin and work in West Berlin anymore, stuff like that. And then bring that capitalist money or go shopping at the mall in West Berlin and then come back to East Berlin, because that's not how communism works, right? So they had to cut that off, so they built the wall. And it became a big symbol of just how the world was divided, how Germany was divided, how Europe was divided, and so on. It fell in 1989, and a lot of people say that was the end of the Cold War. It certainly, seemed like it. I'm going to give you material on Berlin for you to look at your own, but you got to know about Berlin. It was very important. Okay. The Cold War takes up the entire world. The first few years, it was just about how to divide up Europe. But then it goes to Asia. And in 1949, the communists took over China, okay? And there was a big civil war between the communists and the nationalists in China, just like there was in Greece. In Greece, the side that we supported won, the nationalists, but in China, the communists won. And that's how you get communist China. And North Korea also became communist, and South Korea did not. So China is now a communist country. They won the Civil War. Why did they win that Civil War? The other side, the side that we supported, they had a reputation for corruption. And communists had a good reputation for helping the people in the countryside, and China was mostly rural at this time, most people living on farms. And the communists had a good reputation there. The communists were good about putting moles into the nationalist side. So they had secret agents that then turned on the nationalists. And that was another thing that made us very afraid of communists. They find ways to get their spies and get their little moles in there. They did it in China. Are they doing it here in America? That was a big thing. And the United States also kind of withdrew support from the nationalists at a very critical time. And that led to a collapse of the nationalists. All right. And that was another big thing. did we withdraw support from the nationalists because communists are running our government? That McCarthyism that we'll talk about later. You can see that here. So, like I said, the effects of the Chinese Civil War. China becomes communist. That's Mao, the Chinese leader, communist leader. It led to a lot of alarm in the United States, trying to figure out how did containment fail in China. Is it because the State Department is full of commies and sort of stabbed our nationalist friends in the back? It also led to my adopted home country of Taiwan becoming something like an independent country because the side that lost in China moved to Taiwan and they set up their own country. And that's a whole story that I'd love to tell you, but we don't have time. Okay, so that leads us to the Korean War. All right. And let's talk about the Korean War then. The North is communist, the South is capitalist. All right. They divided it this way, this line here. And this was at the end of World War II. Soviet troops came in this way, right? And they put a communist government here in Pyongyang. We put a capitalist government here in Seoul. And so we were friendly to the South, and the North was friendly to the communists. So in 1950, North Korea, all right, led by Kim Il-sung, he wanted to take over South Korea, make it all communist. So he asked Stalin, who was in charge of Russia. He said, "Stalin, can I do this?" Stalin said, "Yes, you can." Stalin wanted to see communism expand, and so he helped out Kim Il-sung to invade the South. So the North invaded the South. All right, and so the Korean War is on. It's 1950. Okay. 1950, the war is on. And the Korean War was kind of crazy in a lot of ways because there was a lot of swinging back and forth, and then it ended in a stalemate. So let's have a look. The North invaded the South, and you see this yellow. That's as far as the North got. They almost took over all of South Korea. Okay. And having taken almost all of South Korea, we got involved like right when it got to about here. We're like, oh, geez, this is not good. Maybe we thought we could give money to the South and some guns, but it turned out that we needed to put our army in there. Otherwise, there's just no way that the South is going to hold on. I mean, so we get our army involved. We put our army here. We start moving them in. We're trying to hold them back. Okay. Then we decide we're going to attack now that we've got our army here. So in a stroke of brilliance, what we did, General MacArthur, to his credit, he can be criticized for a lot of things, but this was his sort of finest hour. He landed our troops actually here, which would be behind where most of the North Korean army was, and just he totally just got behind them and started to wreck the North Korean army here. So as a result, we pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the border with China. So now we're going crazy, pushing them all the way back. Okay. Now China is getting worried because they do not want North Korea to end up going away and becoming all capitalists. So they send their army out this way. All right. And by the time we had gotten this far, we were pretty overextended. We didn't have, we were exhausted. We had made this huge push, and we were getting tired. It was winter. We were kind of strung out on the roads. We were vulnerable. And the communist Chinese took advantage of that. And they sent wave upon wave upon wave of Chinese soldier down this way and pushed us all the way back again. And unfortunately, my grandmother's brother, unfortunately, did not make it out of that. He was up here somewhere when the Chinese counterattacked and lost his life. So, the North is counterattacking the Chinese and so on. They kind of push us back down this way, then we push them back, and the war after 3 years ends up almost exactly where it started. It was very strange, these crazy swings back and forth. And in the end, the war, we decide, okay, fine, let's just pretend this whole thing never happened. North goes back to the North, the South stays in the South, and that's it. Okay. So Korean War is an example of containment, and this is going to be a quiz question, so I want you to pay attention to the Korean example. How is the Korean War an example of containment? Well, in some ways, it's pretty simple. The North invaded the South, and that means that if the North wins, they spread communism to the South. We want to stop it. Okay, that's it. We have to stop communism from spreading, and so we fought this war to do that. And the U.S. also, led a worldwide coalition to do that. But the thing I want you to consider is, was the Korean War a success for the United States, given that our goal was containment? You might say, yes, it was, because look, in the end, South Korea was saved, right? In the end, the North failed to take over South Korea. On the other hand, you could say the Korean War might have been a failure because, look, we could have had it all, and we lost it. We didn't, and so it depends on how you look at it, but that's going to be a quiz question. How was Korea an example of containment? Was it a success? And so on. Okay. All right. Cuba will be the last thing we talk about. So now let's talk about Cuba a little bit. I don't have a map of Cuba. You know where that is. It's that little island thing. Do I have a map? I love maps. I don't have a map handy. All those books, I can't find one map of Cuba. You know where Cuba is. You got Florida. When you go down there, there's this little long, skinny thing. That's Cuba, that island there. And do I seriously not have a map of Cuba? Okay. It's over there. Let me get it. Okay. So that's Cuba. The United States is Florida, and then they got Cuba right down there. Okay, so Cuba is very close. And this guy Castro and Che Guevara, but Castro was the leader, and he's on the left there. He led a revolution against the Cuban government and took power. He was not a declared communist when he took power, and that's maybe one of the reasons why we kind of let him take power. But within a short while, Fidel said, "You know what? I'm a communist." So now there's a communist country 90 miles away from the United States. This is very bad. And many Cubans fled to Miami. That's one of the reasons why Miami is very Cuban in its culture, is because many Cubans, they'd been living there before, but a great many left after Castro took power. So now we've got a problem with containment, right? Because now we've got a communist country right next to us. So containment says we got to stop the spread. And so we did this thing called the Bay of Pigs, where we decided the people that don't like Castro, like these guys here, we're going to train them, we're going to give them guns, and we're going to land them in Cuba and tell them to get rid of Castro. So we landed these guys in there, and unfortunately, the whole thing failed. This ragtag army failed. We did not roll back communism in Cuba, so Castro stayed in power in Cuba. Castro was so upset that we tried to, kill him. Is that he got so upset that he decided to call up his friends, the Russians, and said, "Hey, you know what? Why don't you take some missiles and put them into Cuba, some nuclear missiles?" Okay, so that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis right afterwards, where the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles into Cuba that could hit the United States very quickly, like we'd have no warning, and so that's really bad, right? We can't have missiles into Cuba. So what we did was, Kennedy, the president at the time, he basically took Cuba and he put our boats, our Navy, around Cuba and quarantined or blockaded the island. Quarantine is what we called it. Sound familiar? And said basically no ships can come in and out of Cuba until the Soviets remove the nuclear missiles. The Soviets were sending some boats over there to bring in some more missiles. And for about 13 days, the whole world was as close to nuclear war as we've ever been. Because if we forcibly stopped the Soviet ships from coming into Cuba, that would be That would be an act of war if fighting started there. And then what happens? The Soviets fire off their missiles in Cuba into the United States. If they do that, we got to fire our missiles into the Soviet Union, and then it's over, right? So for 13 days in 1962, that's how long this whole crisis lasted. The world was this close to an actual nuclear war. The boats are coming, and Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, decides, you know what? We're good. We're not gonna put any more missiles there. In fact, we're gonna take our missiles out of Cuba, and that was the agreement in the end. Okay, so the resolution was that the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. We had some missiles in Turkey that were pointed at the Soviet Union, and we said, you know what? Since you're removing missiles from Cuba, we will remove our missiles from Turkey, and we promise we will leave Castro alone. We will not try to invade Cuba. And that was the resolution that got us out of a nuclear war. So the end result is that Cuba did remain communist, but we did get the missiles out. Okay, so was that a success for containment? Yes or no? That's up to you to decide. But just think about it. These are some cool pictures of Cuba. Anyway, yeah, I mean, Cuba is a communist country to this day. On the other hand, it was never used as a base to do anything bad to the United States. We've had our issues with Cuba ever since, but they didn't have the nuclear weapons, and that's maybe the most important thing. You might say that's a containment success, or you might say, in the end, they're still communists, so it wasn't a success. So I want you to think about Korea and Cuba. Were they containment successes or failures, or, so-so? And that's pretty much all we're going to cover for today. So I'll leave you with that, and we will cover more stuff later. And I will find some way to stop this. Okay, that's it.